There's a chance we couldn't even do that. Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. We're learning Maseches Yevamos daf Pei Hey. We're starting 2/3 of the way down at the two dots on the bottom of Pei Daled Amud Beis. Yesterday we quoted this line, and today we're going to dig in. Now we know that there's a principle in halacha called a halal or a halala, which is a person who is a kohen or a kohenes who has become pasul through the tashmish hamita of her parents. She became a psula. However, there are times when one can marry the other. What we saw yesterday was as follows. Gufa, Amar Yehuda Marab, Lohuzru Ksheros Lehinase Lepsulin. There's no warning in halacha for a kohenes who is kosher to marry a man who is a halal. It's mutter for a kohen who is a halal to marry a regular woman in Klal Yisrael. What's not allowed is the reverse, is that a halala cannot marry a kohen. Because she's a pasul and he's not allowed to marry a pasul. Okay, maybe we have a raya from our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say? Hi, Dad. Our Mishnah says halal shenasa kshera is that if you have a halal, a kohen who's a halal, and he marries a kshera, that's what our Mishnah says. My love, isn't this case of a kohenes umay kshera lekahuna? Isn't this a raya brura, a perfect match to the shita of Rab, and therefore he has validated his shita with a Mishnah? So the Gemara responds, nope, not a good raya. Though maybe our Mishnah is speaking about a Yisraelis, not a kohenes, but a Yisraelis, and umay kshera lekahal, and maybe is talking about the fact that she's allowed to marry into the Jewish people, having nothing to do with this case of a halal at all. Says the Gemara, Ihachi, if that's true, then our Mishnah has taught us something that is going to complicate things, because in a case where Ruvain was married to Rachel, and Ruvain yesh lo achi has a brother who's kosher nami kosher lakal, he's also kosher to the kahal. What does that say about Ruvain? Michlal dehu pasal lakal. That implies that Ruvain, the first brother, the brother who's married to Rachel, that implies that he is pasul to the kahal. That was against what Rab is saying. It's also not the din, because we know that a halal is allowed to marry a kshera. Therefore, the Gemara pivots and says, 12 lines from the bottom of Pei Daled Amud Beis Elulav, it must be that the statement of our Mishnah is referring to a kohen. Umidahu kohen, he kohenes. And by virtue of the fact that he must be a kohen, and that we've proven already, it must be that she's a kohenes also. And the Gemara rejects these last four words. Midi iria, is that necessarily true? Hakida isa. Yes, you prove the fact that in our Mishnah, when it refers to yesh lo ach, that it has to be talking about a kohen. That you've done. But why does she have to be a kohenes? And with that, the Gemara basically rejects the comparison of our Mishnah to the statement of Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. Nevertheless, the halacha is that a halal is allowed to marry a kshera, and a halala is not allowed to marry a kohen who's a kosher.
Is a person allowed to make it? The halal is only because of what the parents do.
Right.
So
you can't induce it. It's through a tashmish hamita of sorts that yields the halal. It's one of the big questions in Ashkafa. Why is that fair? It's not. They didn't do anything wrong.
right.
Same thing with the mamzer.
Same thing with the mamzer.
Right, that's where it comes up.
Yeah, it's where it comes up, and it's going to come up again today about mamzers. Okay, so the Gemara now has a fundamental question against Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. This is 10 lines from the bottom. Masiv Ravin bar Nachman. The pasuk says, "Lo yikachu, lo yikachu." This is a famous pasuk. Isha zonava chalila lo yikachu, Isha gerusha me isha lo yikachu, ki kadosh hu leilo kav. A woman who is a zona, she has sold herself for intimacy, v'chalala, or she's a halala by birth from her parents. Lo yikachu, the kohen cannot marry her. And a woman who is divorced from her husband, she also cannot marry. Says the Gemara, what do we learn from here? Milame, this comes to teach us, shehaisha muzheres al yedei ha'ish, that really a woman should have the same warnings as a man. And if the kohen's not allowed to marry a halala, then maybe the Isha Kshera should not be able to marry a halal. That's what the pasuk seems to imply. And if that's true, that puts Rav in a very complex position, because Rav is promoting this idea, a one-directional prohibition, where the halal can marry a kshera, but the halala cannot marry a kosher. So to that, the Gemara says, Amar Rava, all is well. Kol hecha dehu muzhar, he muzheres, the kol hecha dehu lo muzhar, he lo mizdahara. It is a unidirectional warning. And he is the deciding factor. If he has a prohibition, then she does. If she has a prohibition, then it's irrelevant. We only focus on him. And therefore, because he's allowed to marry her, there is no fair warning There is no concern for her. Says the Gemara, how did you learn that from lo yikachu, lo yikachu? You shouldn't have learned it from that pasuk. We should have learned it from a statement of Midir Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Nafka, where he says, Damar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav v'chein tana devei Rabbi Shmuel, ish o isha ki ya'asu mikol chatos ha'adam. The pasuk says that a man or a woman, when they do one of the sins of man, hishvei akasuv isha leish l'chol onshin shebatorah. It seems that a man and a woman are equals when it comes to the halachos. When it comes to each other's halachos. So why are you learning out, Rav, this idea from lo yikachu, lo yikachu? We already learned this idea from isha, isha. And the Gemara says no. Ime hahi, had we only learned it from the general pasuk of isha, isha, speaking about chatos in general, I would have made an error. Hava mina lav hashaveh b'kol. That the rule that the woman's prohibitions follow the man's prohibition is only true with a lav that's shaveh b'kol, a lav that applies across the boards. Aval lav she'eno shaveh b'kol lo. I might have thought that a lav that only applies to a certain sect of Klal Yisrael, namely to a Kohen, I might have thought lo that maybe the halachos are different. Says the Gemara, that's not a good argument because v'harei tuma, we know that when the Torah discusses the prohibition of Kohanim to become tamei unless it's one of the 7 relatives, that is the lav she'en shaveh b'kol that only applies to Kohanim. Not only does it only apply to Kohanim, it only applies to men who are Kohanim. V'taima dekasav rachmana b'nei Aharon v'lo b'nos Aharon. The Torah went out of its way to teach us that it refers only to the Bnei Aaron and that it excludes the Benos Aaron who are allowed to become Tmeos. What do we infer from here? Halav hachi, if not for the fact that the Torah specifically focused on the Bnei Aaron to therefore exclude the Benos Aaron, what is the default? Hava mina, I might have thought nashim chayavos, and my taima, that would have been lav mishum de Rav Yehuda Marav, like the initial statement of Rav Yehuda Marav, that really Rav Yehuda Marav wasn't only talking about a lav hashaveh b'kol, but he was even talking about lav she'ein shaveh b'kol, even a din of Kohanim. Says the Gemara, lo, that's not correct. It's not the right way to learn that. De gamrinan milo yikachu. We actually do need that other pasuk, and we don't learn from Rav Yehuda Marav anything other than a lav that is shaveh to everybody. Then we learn now the halachos of a woman from a man. But when it comes to kahuna, we needed the pasuk of lo yikachu. Ika de amre, another way to skin the cat is kicha itzricha le. We needed the extra word of kicha because it says lo yikachu twice. Sal kadai techamina ligmor mituma. Maybe we should say that we really should learn out from tuma by a kohen, that when it comes to tuma by a kohen, the Torah went out of its way to speak about men, thereby excluding women. So therefore, it's a great place to learn the general rule that outside of that space, we really need to have the assumption that a woman follows a man, Kamash Malan, that we don't learn from Tuma, and we need the Mari Makomos that we discussed in order to learn out the halachos. So that's the end of this little sugya that we've learned here on the bottom. And halacha l'maisa, it seems to be from our Gemara, based on Rav, that a chalal can marry a kshera, can marry a kohenes who is a kshera, and a chalala will be forbidden to the Kohen because the Kohen has a prohibition of marrying a psula, but the Eishes Kohen, the woman, doesn't have a halachic prohibition of marrying a chalal. So on this sugya, the Gemara is going to say, hey, do we really paskin like Rav? The Gemara says, Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua iklu lehinsabu. They went to the city of Hinsabu, la'asre de Rav Idi bar Oven, and they went to the city of Rav Idi bar Oven. While they were there, the Beis Medrash posed a shaila to Rav Papa and Rav Huna. Ba'u minayhu. They asked a question of them. They, the Talmidim and the Beis Medrash, asked a question of them, Rav Papa and Rav Huna. Who's haruk sheros lehinase lepsulan olo? Do we have a prohibition or not in regards to a chalala, in regards to a kshera marrying a halal? Yes or no? So Amar Lahu Rav Papa takes the first stab and he says, Tani Tuha, we've already learned this. And this is a brisa that I believe we've seen before, but it wasn't quoted here. Maybe it'll ring a bell for one of you. Asara Yuchsin Alami Bavel. There were 10 groups of people that came up from Bavel. Kohanim, Levim, V'Yisraelim, of course, the regular Jews. Chalalim, Gerim, V'Charurim, Mamzerim. Chalalim, we know people who are the result of certain inappropriate relationships with Kohanim. Gerim are converts. Charurim are freed slaves. Mamzerim, we know. Nesinim are the Givonim or the Givnonim. Shetuki, V'Asufi are different types of Sveikos, Mamzerus. And these are some of the 10 people. Now, within this group of 10, who is allowed to marry whom? Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim, Mutarim, Lavo, Zebazeh. No problem. All 3 groups can marry one another. Levim, Yisraelim, Chalalim, Gerim, and Charurim, Mutarim, Lavo, Zebazeh. And these groups, a Levi, a Yisrael, a Chalal, and all of these people, a Ger and a Charur, they can all marry one another. And Gere, people who are Gerim, Charure, these are the people who are freed slaves. What's missing from this list? It seems to be that the case of a Kasher kohenes to marry a halal is not listed. Maybe we should therefore infer that Rav is wrong. Amalei Rav Huna b'Rav Yoshua, no. Kol hecha dahani nasbe mehani, v'hani nasbe mehani ktani. When the relationship is allowed in both directions, if the male is a mamzer and the female is a mamzer, or vice versa, so then no problem. But this, as we've discussed, is only a unidirectional halacha. But kohen kevan di'ilu boy leminsav chalala asirale lo ktani. It's not true. You cannot learn from here an exhaustive rule that this list is ever so perfect, that because it doesn't speak about a kshera marrying a chalal, therefore it's usher. The reason why that case wasn't listed is because it doesn't work in both directions. Yes, a chalal can marry a kshera, but no, a kasher cannot marry a chalala. So because it's not taught in both directions, therefore we cannot infer from this brisa. Says the Gemara, so they brought the shaila, they didn't have an answer now. They tried from this brisa of Asara Yuchsin, and also Lakamed Rav Idi Bar Oven. So instead they brought the shaila to Rav Idi Bar Oven. Amar Lahu Dardiki, my dear children, it's not a term of endearment in this case. It means you guys missed the obvious. Hachi Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, like we started with today and like we learned yesterday. Lo Husaru, there are no halachic warnings for ksheros linasi l'psulim. It's absolutely mutter for a kasher, for a kshera, a woman who is kshera, who is a kohenes, to marry a chalal, no problem at all. Because remember, the reason why this distinction is reasonable is because we're only concerned about a kohen marrying a psula. She's not a psula, she's a kshera. What if she was a chalala? Then taka, you're right. Then he's not allowed to marry her because she's a psula. But there's no prohibition for her to marry a pasul. So a woman who's kshera can marry a chalal. We spoke about in our Mishnah yesterday, Shnios Midivrei Sofrim. We're almost halfway down on Pei Hamid Aleph. And we spoke about this idea of rabbinic injunctions for certain relationships with Tashmish Amita. Ba'u minei b'nei Biri mirav Sheshes. A shaila was asked from the people of the city of Biri to Rav Sheshes. Let's say there was a case of Shnia Lebal, where Ruvain and Rachel are married, and really there's a rabbinic injunction on the two of them being intimate. Below Shnia Liyavam, but Shimon, Ruvain's brother, there is no prohibition of her to be intimate with Shimon once her husband dies. So, Yesh la ksuva miyavam olo. In such a case, would she in fact earn a ksuba upon leaving the yavam relationship or no? And here are the two sides of the coin. Kevan de Amar Mar ksuvasa al nichse baila rishon lesle. Maybe we should say that in regards to a ksuba, we typically have a rule that when there's a case of yibum, that the nechasim of the first husband is what pays the actual ksuba. Or maybe because the Chachamim wanted to protect women and make sure that they were willing to get married into this second marriage. And they made a rule that if the first husband had no assets, then she would in fact be able to get a ksuba from the second husband. Maybe therefore in this case, she would have access to a ksuba in the case of the yavam. So Amar Lahu Rav Sheshes responded, Tani Tuva, 2/3 of the way down, not quite. Ksuvasa al nichse baila harishon. Really, it should be that the ksuva should come from the first husband's money, from Ruvain's money. V'imhaisa shniya lebal, and if in fact there was a rabbinic injunction on the second, if there was in fact a rabbinic injunction on her husband, afilu miyavam einla, and then even from the yavam she would get no money. Says the Gemara, that implies mechlal deika deisle miyavam, that there are times that the yavam does give money. This brisa seems to be very confusing. So the Gemara responds, you're correct. Really, this brisa that Rav Sheshes is quoting to answer this question of whether or not there's a ksuba when a woman marries a yavam, in the scenario where Ruvain and Rachel, the first husband, they had an isser d'Rabbanan to be together. Here's pshat in the brisa. Really, when a woman becomes a Yevama and marries Shimon, and then there's a divorce there, she really should get the ksuva money from the first husband, from the yorshim of the first husband. And if the first husband has no estate and no money, it should be the case that the second husband would then have to pay up. But if there was a rabbinic injunction between Reuven and Rachel in the first relationship, then there would be no money to be had whatsoever. And that brings us to another two dots, almost 2/3 of the way down, a little bit more. The Gemara says, Ba minei Rabbi Elazar me Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Elazar, 3rd century Amor to Rabbi Yochanan. In the case of Almana lekohen gadol grusha v'chalutza lekohen hedyo, yesh la mezonos o ein la mezonos. In the case of a marriage that never should have happened, an almana should never marry a kohen gadol, and a grusha and a chalutza should never marry a kohen hedyo. But let's say they do, and they get divorced. Would there be mizonos, or let's say they do and they're not yet divorced? Would there be mizonos? Yes or no? We know anyone who's ever read through a ksuba, we know that mizonos is one of the things that a husband has as a burden on him, on the husband to feed the wife. Does it apply in this case in a marriage that never should have been? So says the Gemara, Hechidami, what is the case scenario? Ilima diyasva to say, if she's sitting there with him, if she's maintaining this relationship that should not be, she should be getting up and leaving the house right now. They're not allowed to be together. The whole thing is miraf sinigra. The whole relationship should not be. Mizonos islay. He has an obligation to feed her. They're also to be married. So therefore, the Gemara says, no, what was the case? He went to his apartment in another place. And and in the process of them ending their relationship, they're not living together anymore. She took a loan to eat food, and then who has to pay back the loan? Does she have to pay back the loan because really the ksuba has no obligation in this usher marriage for him to feed her? Or does he in fact have to pay? Says the Gemara, what's the chakira? Mizone tnai ksuba ninhu, midi isla ksuba isla mizone. Really, mizonos are one of the fundamental conditions of a ksuba. And since she does have a ksuba, albeit in a marriage that's forbidden, isla mizone. O dilma, or perhaps would we say ksuba dila mishkal ula mepak isla. The ksuba, the whole thing should have been thrown out anyway. Says the Gemara, well, mizone dilma te'akiv gabe lesle. If there's mizonos, then she may stay with him, and that would be a big problem. So what's the din? Do we say that she gets mizonos from the ksuba, yes or no, in these forbidden marriages? Amar le, the Gemara responds, lesle. She has no ksuba. Tanya yeshla. The Gemara says that maybe there really should be mizonos for her, and the Gemara responds, no. That brisa which says that maybe there should be for her, kitanya hahi la'achar misa, that only applies after he dies. Then she does get from the yorship. However, when he's alive, she does not get. And is de amre, or really the correct here says probably ika de amre. And if you look in the Mari Makomos on the side here in the Agos V'Tzionim, it highlights the dfus from Venezia. Of the many different girsos, we've had a lot of different iterations of the Gemara over the 1400 when the printing press started. There were a lot of different versions that came up. The one that we have is like the Warsaw, so that's kind of what we use. But there are other versions, and there were some slight differences. And Ika de Amre, some say that the end of this conversation was a little different. Amar Le, that he said to him, Tanya Yeshla, the Brisa says she does get. However, Haba Amud V'Hotzei, that doesn't make sense. Really, she should be getting out of here, and there should not be. Says the Gemara, what should we do with the Brisa? Tanya Yeshla. So the Gemara says, yeah, really, when he's alive, there should be no mizonos. And kitanya hahi la'achar misa. When the Brisa says yeshla that she does have access to mizonos, that's after the husband dies if they had never gotten divorced. That brings us to a Brisa, 8 lines or so, 7 lines from the bottom of Pei Hey Amud Aleph, and we're going to be going to the Mishnah on the bottom of Pei Hey Amud Beis. Let's continue. Tanu Rabbana, the rabbis have taught us in a case of Almana LeKohen Gadol and Asr marriage, Grusha V'Chalutza LeKohen Hedjot, another Asr marriage. Yeshla, she does get ksuba, peiros, mizonos, and belos. She does get her ksuba. She gets fruits that she brought into the marriage. She gets food, mizonos, and she gets belos, which are clothing that she brought to the marriage for her husband. V'hipsula v'vlada pasul. Not only is she psula for the tashmish amita with this person she's not allowed to be married to, but her child is also considered a pasul. And as well, the kofen osolahosi, we don't allow this marriage to take place. This happens in the community. I know people, I'm sure you all do too, a Kohen who decided to marry a grusha. When I was a kid, one of my classmates, his mom married a Kohen. She's a grusha, married a Kohen. So halacha is the kofen osolahosi. It's not right. They should not be living together. They shouldn't be living in the same house. There might be an isur yichud. There's certainly an isur tashmish amita. It's unacceptable. We should be pushing people to get divorces. And we're going to be discussing now some of the ways we motivate people to get divorced. So the Brisa continues, Shnios midivrei sofrim. What about times when the marriage is not an isur deoraisa, but the marriage is really shnios midivrei sofrim? It's only a din derabanan. So 4 lines from the bottom of Pei Hey Amud Aleph, the Gemara says, in regards to shnios midivrei sofrim, ein la ksuba, she doesn't get a ksuba. We're harsher with the rabbinic scenarios than we are with the biblical ones, and that's going to be a machlokes tanaim as to why that's true. We'll see momentarily. She gets no ksuba, lo peros lo mazonos v'lo belos. She doesn't get fruit. She doesn't get fed by her husband's family. V'lo belos. She doesn't get the clothing that she had brought to the marriage for the sake of her husband. The kshera, she's still considered a kshera because there's no psul deoraisa in the tashmish amita. It's only rabbinic in nature. V'vlada kasher, and still the kofen osolahodzi. So the Gemara makes a sharp and strange distinction between a marriage which is an Isser Doraisa, where she still gets ksuba, she still gets peros, she still gets mazonos and belos. Mashein Ken, when it's shnia midivrei sofrim, it's only rabbinic injunctions on the marriage. There she doesn't get a ksuba, and she doesn't get peros, and she doesn't get the belos, and she doesn't get the mazonos. Very strange. We'll see in the Gemara why that's true. And okay, good. 2 lines from the bottom, the Gemara says, Amar Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Let's remember his name. It's going to come up. Why is it that in the case of the marriage that really is forbidden midoraisa, why is it that when this almana is married to a kohen gadol, she gets a ksuba? Shehu pasal v'hi psula, because both of them are pasal. V'chol makom shehu pasal v'hi psula. In any case scenario where the husband is a pasal and she is a psula, kansu oso ksuba. We punish him in that he has to give a ksuba because we want to motivate him to get divorced. Why in the case where there's only a rabbinic injunction on the intimacy, why there do we say ein lahen ksuba? Because since the tashma shamit is only rabbinic in nature, nobody has the status of a puzzle, and therefore a woman would rather be married, albeit in a rabbinically prohibited marriage, than to not be married at all. And therefore, we tell her this is a marriage where you don't have a ksuba. You're not protected in this marriage. You might want to run now before things get bad. He can just toss you out and throw you a ksuba with no money in it, and you're a get, I should say, throw you a get, and your relationship is over. So the rabbis removed, it's a koach of the chachamim, to be lak, or it's not really davar min Torah, but to undo the ksuba, because they wanted this marriage to end. So that is what Reb Shimon ben Elazar says. However, Rebbe Omer that there's something else going on. Halalu divrei Torah, v'divrei Torah ein tzrichin chizuk. V'halalu divrei sofrim, v'divrei sofrim tzrichin chizuk. When it comes to the relationship that's aser midoraisa, the almana lekohen gadol, and the grusha v'chalutza lekohen hedyot, the Torah doesn't need any help. The Torah is fine. The regular ksuba can be given. We don't need to intercede and interfere on behalf of a Kadosh Baruch Hu here. Don't worry. It's an Isser Doraisa marriage. Nobody's stupid. Everybody knows what the din is. They got into this marriage on their own. They know what's going on. Poor decision, but we're not messing around. We don't need to change rabbinic laws to strengthen a din doraisa. However, when it comes to rabbinic injunction marriages, when it comes to shnios midivrei sofrim, there divrei sofrim tzrichin chizuk, and therefore we do have to change one of the halachos, and that is whether or not a woman earns her ksuba when she willingly enters into a marriage that is aser midrabanan. And then the Gemara says that the Brisa writes davar acher. We don't know yet who the author is. Zehu margila, v'zo he margilaso. The Gemara makes a distinction. It depends. One is where he promotes the marriage, and the other is where she promotes the marriage. Who is the author of this line? Davar acher man ktanila. Who is the author that says that it really depends on who motivated the relationship? And Ika de Amre, we're 8 lines down, Pehem and Beis. Ika de Amre, according to some, it's Reb Shimon ben Elazar Ktanila, and all that's happening now is really Umatam Ka'amar. Really, this Davar Acher is just an extension of the initial opinion of Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Reb Shimon ben Elazar's opinion, as quoted on the bottom of Pehem and Aleph, 2 lines from the bottom, said that the reason why we want them to get divorced is because he wants this marriage. He wants this marriage, so we force him to pay the ksuba to get them divorced. That's why in the case of the almana lekohen gadol, that there's still a ksuba because we want to force him out of the marriage. And what's the umatam? So back in the Gemara, 10 lines down, matam amru hu pasal v'hi psula kansu oso ksuba. Why is it that we say that when the marriage pasals them both, such as in a case where an almana is married to a kohen gadol, that he still has to pay the ksuba? Mipnei shehu margila. He had to convince her to get married. That was not a simple thing for them to do, and therefore he is the one who has to pay the ksuba. Umatam in the case of shnios midivrei sofrim, umatam hu kasher v'hikshera kansu osa ksuba. According to this line of reasoning of Reb Shimon ben Elazar, with this mixed idea of margila and margilto, why is it that we now have to say that when both of them are kosher and it's only a rabbinic relationship on a prohibited rabbinic relationship that she doesn't get a ksuba? Margilto, because since she wants to get married, she doesn't want to be alone. She'd rather be in a rabbinic injunction marriage. Fine. So then that's the din. So then that's why the Gemara makes this distinction, and she doesn't get a ksuba. Ika de Amar Rav Ktanila. Some say that actually the words Davar Acher, the line of Davar Acher about Margila, is actually a new version of Rebbe, because Rebbe's first shita doesn't hold water. Rebbe's first shita was that divrei Torah don't need chizuk and divrei sofrim do need chizuk. But the Gemara presents a problem with that. Ika da'amri Rav K'tanilo, Rav had to give a second answer because the chalutza kakashele. The case of chalutza is a din d'oraisa, is a din d'rabbanan in this case. Chalutza d'rabbanan v'isla ksuba. It's a conflict of terms where really the marriage to the chalutza in this particular case was a din d'rabbanan, but she still gets a ksuba, and therefore he had to reject his answer. And hadar amar kevan de pasile midrabbanan, since midrabanan, this person will become pasal. Zehu margila v'zohi margilato, and this is where the Gemara makes this distinction, where Rebbe would want to possibly use this answer. Then the Gemara asks a third of the way down, and this will take us to the end of the page. Ma'ika ben Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Ma'ika ben Rebbe the Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. What is the difference between the shitas of Rebbe and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? The Gemara did just present a possibility that Rebbe had to change his answer because of the case of Chalutza, but for the sake of the next five Ika Beinayus, the five differences that we're about to learn between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Elazar, we're under the assumption that the machlokes is as follows. Reb Shimon ben Elazar was of the opinion, as he mentioned, that that in a case of pasal and psula, he has a burden to pay, and when in the case where it's kasher and ksheira by shnios midrabanan, she does not get her ksuba. And Rebbe was of the opinion that divrei Torah do not need chizuk, whereas divrei derabanan do. So now the Gemara says, what's the difference in these two shitas? And the Gemara presents its first of five answers, a third of the way down. Amar Rav Chizda, mamzeres unesina leYisrael ikabeinahu, a mamzera or a nesina. If one of these women marries a Yisrael, this is a big difference between them. Man de Amar, according to Rebbe, who holds deoraisa, hanami deoraisa. This is still a case that's mideoraisa. The isser for a mamzeres or a nesina to marry Yisrael is an isser deoraisa, and therefore he would still be obligated to pay the ksuba. But man de Amar mibnei shehu margila, according to the one who says that we determine the payment of a ksuba based on who created the relationship, hahi margila, she's the one who pushed for the relationship because she was a mamzeres already. She wanted to get married at least to someone. So she pushed for the marriage to happen. Therefore, she loses her ksuba. The Gemara says this can't be a good difference between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Elazar because of the Rabbi Eliezer, the Amar, Hareze Eved Mamzer, Halom Margila Levelo Mili. There is a case scenario that we have in halacha where a mamzer has tashmish amita with a shifcha kananis. The child has both the status of Eved and mamzer. In such a case, the mamzeres, or the mamzer in this case, the woman in this case would not be happy with that halom margila levelo midi, and therefore that breaks the rule that we just tried to present here. That breaks this as one of the possible differences, the case of a mamzeres and a nesina to Yisrael. So the Gemara halfway down moves on to the second difference between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Elamar of Yosef, we're really talking about a case. The difference between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Elazar is machzir grushaso mishenises ika beinayu. We've had this case 10 times. The case of machzir grushaso is Reuven is married to Rachel, they get divorced. Rachel marries a random guy, Chaim, and then they get divorced. Rachel now wants to remarry her initial husband. That's an Isser Doraisa. Man do Amar Doraisa, according to Rebbe, who says that we determine whether or not she gets a ksuba based on the Doraisa status. This is Doraisa, Hanami Doraisa, and therefore she gets a regular ksuba. Man do Amar Reb Shimon ben Elazar is of the opinion who holds Mibnei Shehu Margila, because maybe he's the one who caused the relationship. Hahi Margila, she is the one who caused for this relationship. She went back into the marriage knowing full well that it was completely usher, and therefore she doesn't get a ksuba. Says the Gemara, this doesn't work. According to Rabbi Akiva, who says that even when there's a regular lab, you can become a mamzer. Halom margila levelomidi. She would never want this marriage, and therefore this nafkamina also doesn't work. So the Gemara, 2/3 of the way down, presents the third possible difference between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Elazar. What's the case? It's also for a Kohen Gadol to marry a woman who has lost her virginity. According to the one who says that when we're dealing with Dine Doraisa, she still gets her ksuba. Well, guess what? Hanami Doraisa. It's an Isser Doraisa for a Kohen Gadol to sleep with a woman who's a Be'ula, and therefore she still gets her ksuba. And according to Reb Shimon ben Elazar, who says that the determining factor of whether or not she gets her ksuba is who engendered the relationship, she's the one who started this relationship, and therefore she'll lose her ksuba. Says the Gemara, that only works according to some. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Damar yesh chalal mechai ve'aseh, that you can still generate a chalal even though the isser, according to him, between a be'ula and a kohen gadol is mechai ve'aseh, because the Torah says that he has to marry a besula. It doesn't say he can't marry a be'ula. It says he has to marry a Basula. The violation of that law is not an Isser Lav, it's an Isser Aseh. So says the Gemara that according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, a halal can be created from Chai Be'aseh, halom margel alev lomidi, she would never engender that relationship, and therefore this distinction doesn't work. So let's move on to the fourth possible distinction, 3/4 of the way down. If a person is intimate with his sota wife while she is on the way to get the sota, to drink the mei sota, man damar doraisa, according to the one who says that a woman keeps her ksuba when the relationship has a din doraisa status, hanami doraisa. This too has a din doraisa status. Uman damar b'bnei shehu margila, and according to the one who says that the determining factor of whether or not she gets her ksuba is who engendered the relationship, hahi margilale. She knows that she's down for the count. She's becoming a suffix sota. She could die. She'd rather be with her husband. So she pushed the relationship. Says the Gemara, not simple.
Because she won't drink. If she convinces him to be
right.
with her, she's out.
I thought it was. I wasn't even thinking about that.
She doesn't have to drink. So
if they have Tashbis Amita.
Correct. So she's really got skin in the game. If she convinces him to be with her, when they get to the base of English, she doesn't drink. So therefore, she knows that she's going to explode. Here's the way out.
Right.
Because she's basically.
If it's Bala Bader, correct. So he Margalale means really in the best interest.
Yep. That's for sure. I was thinking about death, but that's a good point. It avoids the whole thing altogether.
Right.
So the Gemara then says that doesn't work according to everyone. Well, the Rav Masi ben Charash Samar afilu halach baila lahashkosa ubalea bederech asa azona. According to the Shita that says that when a suffix sota, a woman on her way to drink the mei sota is intimate with her husband, forget about whether or not she drinks anything else. She becomes a zona. That's not good. So then if that's the case, Rashi says she'd rather drink the water. Rashi says 3/4 of the way down, she'd rather not be a zona. She would never want to be psula to a kohen. So therefore, she would not want to become a zona. She wouldn't sleep with her husband. So therefore, the Gemara says its final distinction, Ela Amar Mar Baravashi Sota Vadai Ikabe Nahu. What we're talking about is a case of sota vadai. And here the distinction is clear. The Gemara doesn't even bother articulating the two sides. If you're talking about an Isser Doraisa, if she's a sota vadai, they're not allowed to sleep together, and therefore she would still get her ksuba. But if you're looking at who is motivating the relationship, a sota vadai can't marry. She the only person she'd want to be with is her husband. So she's margulale, and therefore she'd lose her ksuba. We'll stop right here and start with a fresh Mishnah tomorrow on the bottom of Pehem and Beis. Wishing you all a beautiful night.
Wait a second. So if they